Hello, everyone. It is right at 12:15 Eastern Time, and so we are going to begin. My name is Camilla Roberts. I am actually the Director of the Honor and Integrity System at Kansas State University, but also serving as President of the International Center for Academic Integrity. We'd like to thank you all for joining us for our second of 3 webinars that we're hosting due to the change in academic climate and how we are all having to work with our students over these past couple weeks. So this second webinar is going to be focusing more on assessments, kind of some tips and techniques that you might be able to adjust when you're doing your own assessments. It'll be presented by Dr. Douglas Harrison, who is the Vice President and Dean of the School of Cybersecurity and Information Technology at the University of Maryland Global Campus. We also have several moderators, myself, then Amanda McKenzie, who is from the University of Waterloo, and also the Secretary of ICII, and also Tricia Bertram Gallant, who is the Director of Academic Integrity at UC San Diego and Board Emeritus of ICAI. Also on is Jean Guerrero-Dib, who is from the University of Monterey and also a board member of ICAI. As you see on your screen now, please mute yourself and remain muted. You may feel free to ask questions inside the chat room. We will be monitoring those and making a document so that we will be able to ask Doug and or other moderators those questions at the end. If you have any problems, use that chat room and we can be able to help you. We will, like I said earlier, we are recording this webinar, and so we will be sending it out to all registrants of this webinar, and then also posting it on the ICAI website. So with that, I will turn it over to Doug and let him take it from there.
Thanks, Camilla, and thanks to all of you for joining us today, wherever you are and whatever time it may be where you are. Camilla talked about the ICAI's hosting of this, and today the University of Maryland Global Campus, where I work, is delighted always to be a partner with the ICAI, but also particularly to partner for this particular presentation. So let's get started. We're going to have a handful of goals around thinking about assignments and assessments as we move to an online teaching environment. First of all, thinking about what are some critical contexts and messages for faculty in the fast mass move to remote instruction and to assessment, to think about what are the key ways to make sure that integrity is part of what we're doing, especially in assessment design, because that's a critical component of what we're coming up to in most terms, in term structures for most institutions. Survey some of the key approaches that we can use in assignment and assessment development online, and then connect those best practices to specific tips and techniques for online teaching. So first of all, let's really start with probably the most critical, I think, context and message that all of us need to hear, tell each other, tell ourselves. And that is at least one way that I think about it. I posted this on LinkedIn the other day, so I'm going to not claim that I'm the first person to say this, but these particular order of sequence of words were original to me, I think, about online education is remote learning, but the remote learning is not always online education. And by this, I'm just trying to suggest what many people have noted as we've made this transition over the last several weeks, that much of what we're going to have to do just to support students and help them succeed in the completion of this term is really tactical and remote teaching, but it really doesn't have the full encompassing aspects of what is considered really true online education. That is a wraparound, life cycle complete support for students from the moment they enter the online ecosystem of teaching and learning, the tutoring and the wraparound support, the academic success tools, a rich environment in the classroom, with educational technology that really is aligned to what we're doing. All of those things are probably not going to always be present in what we're doing right now. And that's okay, because that's where we find ourselves. That's the situational factors that we have. But I think it's really important to note that this is what we're doing right now is probably not what good online learning always really looks like. And I think we use this moment to get closer to that. But it's important to really have that distinction in mind. So what do we need to keep in mind as we start talking about this strategic move and tactical move online. First is that, let's just be clear that the immediate goal here is to support our students this term. We've really just got to be creative, inventive, and make sure that we remind ourselves that the key goal is really supporting students. And that will mean that we'll have to be creative and make sacrifices at times about what we would have liked to have done in the face-to-face world, but we don't have to sacrifice the authenticity and the integrity of that experience. The immediate goal here is really not trying to recreate every aspect of your face-to-face class in an online setting, because there's a factor of untranslatability when we move from a face-to-face educational setting to online. And I like this image as just a little thought experiment to help us think through what that means. If you look at this image, each of these three students are manifesting three different kinds of academic citizenship persona, if you will. You've got the student who's always sitting up front, always prepared, wanting to participate in the discussion. It feels natural or comfortable in that kind of direct and didactic interaction. You've got a student sitting behind her to our left who's seems to be at least engaged enough to be taking notes, doesn't have any textbook or materials with her, so maybe there's a desire to be engaged, but maybe not full preparation. And then you've got a student who's got the books, but really doesn't seem to be engaged in the way that we might want to see someone, with some sort of note-taking device or technology in front of her. And so these are three different, very typical kinds of teaching interactions that we have in the classroom, and we respond in both a push and a pull way to these signals naturally. It's intuitive in how we think as teachers in a classroom. And when you're online, it's a good thing to start thinking about how do you discern the different kinds of persona that you naturally can see and respond to and interact with in the classroom, but that you have to be more intentional about figuring out ways to respond to those different persona in an online environment. So it's not just waiting for a student to show up to discussions, it's reaching out to students who don't seem to be present. It's making sure there are multiple ways for students to engage, and we're going to talk about some of those in just a moment. But that untranslatability means that it's not just going to be an exercise of trying to recreate what you've done in the face-to-face classroom, but really think about goals that you're trying to achieve, what the critical ones are, and how best to do that. So this is the basic backwards design model that we all use to think about how curriculum is constructed. And ideally, of course, we'd like to have a start to finish approach where we can sit down and think intentionally about how to design an online classroom from the beginning and build assessments aligned to active and learning teaching activities. But we know realistically the reality of the global situation doesn't allow us to do that. And so we've got to be tactical and practical about what we can do. And for a little bit here, I want to focus particularly on assessment, because it's really the critical phase of things that most of us are arriving at in the structure of our term. And we really have an opportunity here to engage in assessment online that allows us to optimize the alignment of assessments to teaching and learning activities that have preceded it. Even though most of those have happened in a face-to-face environment so far, we can still do assessment in an authentic and rich way to support students' ability to demonstrate what they've learned effectively. And this is really critical. We can do an imperfect and an incremental transition that all of us are going through if you're in a face-to-face environment that's moved online. It can be academically sound and authentic. And I say that with a fair amount of conviction and confirmed experience working at the University of Maryland Global Campus, which is almost entirely 100% online, and we have been for many years. We really know and believe in the ability to do authentic online education. And we know that it can be done even in the kind of situation that most of you who don't live in a sort of DNA of online education world, we know that that's possible. And a critical component of it is the authentic assessments that are central to authentic education. I'm borrowing an image from my colleague Tricia Bertram Gallant that you've probably seen, especially if you saw or part of the presentation she gave last week. But the moral obligation supply chain means that if we're going to authenticate and certify the knowledge and the skills of our students, then we've got to do so in a way that is not just authentic in terms of being honest, it's critical, but it's also important for authenticity in terms of the way that the student is able to demonstrate what they know. So what do we mean by authentic assessment? It gets tossed around a lot in teaching and learning conversations, but it's really important to know at least, even if this isn't a shared definition, at least how we're going to talk about it for the next few minutes. And this goes back to Grant Wiggins, who's sort of the great ancestor of authentic assessment as a concept and practice. And it really boils down to giving students the opportunity to demonstrate what they know in the kind of problems that they will be faced as citizens and consumers and professionals in the world beyond our classrooms. And that allows them to engage in something that is more meaningful to them in most cases than simply being asked to show what they can remember. Rather, it's showing what they know in authentic constructs. And so some of the features of an authentic assessment are that it's realistic, that it's requiring students to engage in judgment and innovation, to do and show. It replicates how people are tested, if you will, or asked to engage in life and work. It assesses students' ability to efficiently and effectively use a range of knowledge and skills and abilities that build into competence. And it allows the appropriate opportunities to be practiced in a scaffolded way before the summative demonstration of learning. So I know there's a lot of information on this slide. Because it's being recorded and you'll be able to return to it, I wanted to err on the side of giving more information and opportunities for you to find what you might need in your situation, even though it's not necessarily how I always want to construct these kinds of things. But this is a situational factor I'm responding to as well. So on the left-hand side, you see a traditional assessment. On the right-hand side, you see authentic assessments. What I want to be clear about is that this is not, if you end up on the left side of the screen, you're in the bad zone and only things on the right side are good. These different types of assessments are going to depend on the situational factors of what you're trying to accomplish. But in general, authentic assessments tend to be ones that will allow students to demonstrate what they know in the ways that they'll be asked to do it in life and work, as we discussed. And it's also, there's a metacognitive component to authentic assessments that often give them an added value over more traditional assessments. And that is in the moment of assessment itself. It sends a powerful signal to students about how we imagine them and how they imagine themselves as academic citizens. And more traditional assessments that raise the stakes in very direct and objective kinds of forms can tend to really increase the stress levels that students have about assessment, feeling as if they're being put on the spot in a kind of adversarial way. And that we know is a driver of cheating behaviors. And so authentic assessments can really engage students in the assessment to bring them to the point where they might not always be thrilled about it, but they might have a more meaningful attachment to the opportunity to demonstrate knowledge. And so let's try this at home for a second. You're probably at home, so that's a good place to do it. Let's think about a faculty member in health sciences who's seeking to replace a multiple choice exam on nutrition, digestion, and metabolism. Think for a second about ways that that faculty member could introduce more authentic assessments than just a multiple choice exam, for instance. You can put ideas in the chat to share with people, because I did a version of this presentation last week with some other colleagues, and there were some really great ideas. Some of the things that came up then were asking students to monitor their own nutrition and metabolic indicators that for a week, and then to do an analysis of that compared against guidelines and recommendations from the FDA. Another was to do an analysis of different restaurant options and compare that against recommended health choices. Another was to design a plan for a specific healthcare situation, like diabetes care or elder care situations, based on nutritional guidelines that have been introduced in the class. And so these are ways that really ask students to engage in things that they can really find meaningful for themselves, and actually can also anticipate and imagine themselves in situations using the knowledge, skills, and abilities, the competencies of this learning in actual environments outside the classroom, which of course is the goal that we're always aiming for in working with students. So let's talk about designing things online. First, the conceptual level, what you want to do in terms of designing assignments, whether it's online or off, in this case online, depends on where you are in the learning process and what function, in this case, assessment is providing. It's not just what you assess at the end, though that's where we're approaching in most terms, but it's how that summative assessment, the place where we grade students' ability to have met our expectations in terms of learning outcomes, that's a downstream effect of first the diagnostic, either self-assessment or the diagnostic tools that we introduce early on in the class, the formative assessment, that rich feedback that students are getting from you in multiple ways throughout the term in order to know, are they on the right track before they're actually graded, before that summative experience. And then the summative experience allows them to demonstrate the things that they've been practicing and mastering up to that point in the term. And so a lot of us are about to be in the summative assessment phase of things. And so let's talk a little bit about different kinds of assessment constructs. One way to think about what we termed traditional versus authentic a few slides ago is to actually flip that rhetorical concept for a second and think about different kinds of assessments that do supply versus construct models. In the supply model, predetermined options are given to students and they make selections. And these are really common exam examples that we can all think of. And they have some merits because they're easy to grade, but they're also narrow gauge measures, and they decontextualize the measurement of what students know and are able to do. The construct responses give students opportunities to create their own demonstration of that learning. And so these are the richer forms of assessment that we're familiar with: essays, short answer, blank fills, sentence completions. These aren't an exhaustive list, mind you, but these are examples of ways to, even if it's not possible, say, to do a full-blown project as a final summative assessment, there are still ways that you can introduce manageable forms of assessment into an online environment so that you can have students be closer to more authentic demonstrations of what they know. Because typically, authentic assessments are the ones that give the students the richest ability to respond. And yes, we're probably not surprised at this point to talk about Bloom's a bit, but I don't want to miss an opportunity to really reinforce the importance, especially as we move online, to pause for a moment and reflect or remind yourself about what you're trying to assess. What level, taxonomic level or goal are you trying to assess with a summative assessment? Because where you are trying to assess in this hierarchy will help drive some of the choices you make when you think about the different ways you can construct an assignment or an assessment as you're moving things to an online environment. An assessment can do multiple levels, but your intentionality about knowing what that level is going to be critical in order to know how to construct the most effective assessment. Another sort of information-rich slide that attempts to come at this from a slightly different angle and starts to unpack different kinds of assessments, what they're doing, and what the pros and cons of them are. Again, I'm not going to march through all of this because I want to get to the more tactical parts of this and also to your feedback. But you can see that, that when you're thinking about the right assessment, it depends again on what you're trying to do. It doesn't make one superior to the other in every case, but it does give you a sense of the different kinds of things that you can accomplish with different kinds of assessments. In general, this isn't perfect, but in general, as you move from the top row toward the lower row, you're getting a higher order of taxonomical leverage with the assessment in terms of Bloom's hierarchy. Now, that said, scenario-based projects and portfolios constructed in the right way, and if they are of the right cognitive load, can be very rich assessment models for Bloom's hierarchy. But in general, as they're often deployed, you can kind of think about this as a continuum. So let's talk about the tactical stuff. So here's a list of assignment and assessment activities. And what I've tried to do here is map them to some of the specific technology tools or resources that might be useful for them. Now, there are a lot of caveats here. First, I want to say that I am not endorsing any of the tools that might be listed here specifically by name. I'm simply offering them as exemplars. The second big caveat is that how you will do this kind of mapping in your own situation is going to be really contingent on what kinds of technologies are provided or not by your institution. So first of all, the big one is what learning management system or platform, what LMS do you use in online learning? And they're going to have slightly different ways to do a lot of these things, but most of them have common functions like the ability to put students in groups, the ability for you to provide different kinds of feedback, both objective and more qualitative feedback. They have a different quiz and exam features. So all of that's going to be dependent on how you do that. So it might shake out a bit differently depending on what you've got. But for self-assessments, there's usually a baked-in tool in your LMS. If there isn't, you can look for the best kind of workaround that you can find. And always, you can construct this in a Word doc if you have to. That's not the most elegant, but it will work. And what will work is what we want to focus on at this point. Reflective journal writing, I think if now more than ever, giving students and giving the students opportunities to self-reflect in writing about this moment and do some metacognitive reflection on what this process has been like is going to be really important. Both the process of how the shift from face-to-face to online learning works, and also what is their larger metacognitive and social emotional response to this. We've got to be present for our students in all of those regards to support them most successfully. It's not automatic that students know how to learn online, and so we don't want to take that for granted. Faculty also have to give ourselves time to self-reflect about this transition pedagogically, academically, and our own social emotional relationship to it. And the level of vulnerability that we're able to empower our students and ourselves to have in reflective journal writing can be a really powerful tool to help surface some of the ways that you might not otherwise have been aware of what your students are engaging in. Think about those students we looked at the start of the presentation, that some of the ways to surface the different persona represented there is to give your students the opportunity to reflect about this process and surface first with themselves and then with you about what it is that's most important for them, what they need. Discussion posts are really often thought of as the heart of online learning. That might be a disputable statement for some of us, but it nevertheless is the reality that certainly now one of the most straightforward and easy to deploy tools for presence and engagement with your students is online discussions. I'm going to talk about a tool for thinking about how to really be intentional about discussions in a moment. But get to know the discussion board functionality in your LMS. There are some other tools out there. Some of them cost money, some of them don't. That if you absolutely don't have an LMS, again, you can recreate. But it's almost certain that you're going to want to think about how discussions are going to work in and around the teaching and learning activities and with them that will lead to your assessments. Blogs and wikis can be good ways to help go beyond just the kind of linear nature of discussions and allow you to thread and build out a richer kind of ecosystem of co-constructed and self-constructed knowledge that your students engage in as they're working online independently and as they're working together and with you. Peer assessments can be really powerful tools for helping students engage in that co-construction of knowledge and themselves develop the skills to think about how to evaluate the quality of contributions that they and their peers are making. And the LMS, it usually has that same self or peer assessment tool that we talked about in self-assessment. Electronic portfolios are good ways to help collect artifacts that have been produced across the teaching and learning process. Their utility right now is really going to be dependent heavily on what has come before in the face-to-face environment and what the student has been able to produce that can be introduced into the online ecosystem to construct that. But if that's a situational factor that works for you in your teaching setting, then Canvas the Canvas Learning Management System calls it a folio tool. There are lots of free trials for software apps out there. And again, if that's something your institution will allow and support, then that's a way to do portfolios as well. Case studies are a really rich, authentic way of engaging students in both the formative process of practicing and developing skills and abilities, and as summative assessments as well. And they're usually group tools in learning management systems where you can put students in a subset of students in a group And that gives them a kind of protected space within the LMS and access to some of the collaboration tools like group engagements with each other, and ways to have discussion boards that are unique to their situation, and let's use a moment of learning from me right now where I should have turned a system off that's showing you my announcements. Think about that when you're engaged with students, to have things like your email turned off and your chat functions, both as distractors, which that just was for me, and also because sometimes information that you might not want your students to see may pop up on the screen. Case studies can be very rich tools, ways for students to collaborate. So putting students in a group, giving them a case study, and having them work for a certain amount of time on responding to that case study, and giving them clear guidelines for how you want the deliverable to be constructed, can be a really helpful way, again, for them to practice before they've been summatively assessed, or the summative assessment itself. Just make sure that there's alignment between the things that you ask them to do in the case study as practice, and then how you construct the summative. You wouldn't want to go from a case study as the practice to a multiple choice exam as the summative, because there isn't alignment in that case between how you've been asking students to teach, how you've been teaching them, and how they've co-constructed knowledge with each other, and then how you turn around and summatively assess them. So it needs to be alignment there when we talk about that, the alignment between those activities. Role-playing, simulation, games, online technologies are really well suited for that. Zoom, what we're using right now, if you have access to it, or some sort of other platform like WebEx or Skype, can be really helpful ways for your students to engage in role-playing and simulation and gamified educational experiences. And with the appropriate disclosures and awareness and transparency, you can ask them to, and guidance and guidelines, you can ask them to record those. You don't necessarily always have to be present for those, and sometimes the richer learning can go on when they're sent off on their own to work independently, after you've provided them with the supported mentoring and guidance and teaching they need to successfully capture what you want for them in the role playing and the simulation or the gamified experience. And so almost all of these technologies will allow students to see each other in kind of the Brady Bunch or Hollywood Squares format, where their faces are all equally distributed across the screen so they can see each other, and they can inhabit the role that you've assigned to them. Storytelling, similarly, can be very effective. Another rich, authentic assessment. In Canvas, there's a really good storytelling tool called Adobe Spark, which is an adaptation of an Adobe product. And I've linked to some other similar tools here. We'll unpack these links after the presentation and put them in a document, as Camilla alluded to, at the top of the presentation, so that you'll have availability to what stands behind these links. Shared whiteboarding is kind of an adjacent mode to role-playing, simulation, and case study group work. This can happen individually or collectively, where students sort of work through a problem or a thought process or a complex multi-layered concept, and really start to visually document how it is that they're unpacking it. This is simply a show your work kind of exercise. Another really great formative way to engage students in practicing skills and knowledge acquisition and abilities. It could also be, if it's feasible, a really valuable way to do summative assessment, to ask students in groups to, again, be on Zoom with you and use some of these tools like Jamboard to engage in whiteboarding. Group projects are pretty standard. The group tool and the LMS should help you with that. And those can usually take more or less the shape of what you have been trying to accomplish in the face-to-face class and translate it into an online environment. Just remember to give your students the guidance and the kind of swim lanes or parameters about working in online groups, because it's not always obvious to students all the different ways they can and should engage with each other in terms of discussion boards, in terms of shared documents, the engagement and chat space within the LMS. So make sure that you've thought that through a little bit, and also be transparent with them that you're doing your best, and that you're trying to think of everything, but you might not in every case. And so they need to be flexible and patient, just as you are with them. And then chat and collaboration tools, Teams, Google Hangouts, The chat functions within the LMS can be helpful. Leverage those both interacting with your students. They can be a good way to do office hours individually or collectively with students for drop-ins and for intentional exchanges that if the students reach out an email and said, I need help with this thing, sometimes it's easier to jump on a chat or a hangout and resolve the question in the way that you can be back and forth much more easily than an email. And it lowers the pressure and the stakes on the student to have a much more natural interaction. It's more like probably what many students are most familiar with. So let's wrap up with some purely tactical tips for activities and engagement, and then we'll get to questions. Let's be reasonable about what's possible. If you lower the pressure and demand in terms of quantity of work, you're probably going to make things more authentic for students because they won't be as pressurized, and the less pressure environment leads to less cheating. Remember that students don't engage the same way online, and so think intentionally about how you're going to structure engagements. Discussions, individual feedback in writing, voice notes, announcements, synchronous and asynchronous videos, and just audio or a mix of both. Those different modes of presentation will really support learning because different students are going to engage most effectively in different ways. Leveraging the LMS engagement metrics, there's almost always a tool and a learning management system that will tell you when students are logging on and what they're doing in the classroom. And so you can see who's engaged and how and in what way, and you can target your outreach to students who aren't engaging or who are engaging in the wrong way. If the student's always logging in but only going to the discussion boards when you need them to be in the assignment area, that's a point to reach out and say, hey, great job on the discussions. Now let's go leverage what you've learned there and work on the assignments that are coming up. If you can't reach out to every student individually, to see how they're doing, check on them and provide them support. Focus on the most at-risk students by engagement, by their grades and performances, by what you know about them already from having spent all the term with them up till now. And give them multiple ways to practice and demonstrate learning. So in ways that we've already discussed, one-on-one with you, with their peers, in discussions, and other forms. I really like this article on strategies to develop cognitive presence online classrooms. I actually used it for years when I taught face-to-face because it's great learning science, but it came out as so many educational innovations do out of the online world. And there's really some great tips in there about the 4 phases that most conversations and discussions go through and how to construct your question stems so that they elicit what you want to accomplish in that phase of the conversation and don't hurry students along or bog them down in one versus the other. In terms of tests and exams, we know that no matter how much we might try to go to authentic tests and authentic assessments, there are going to be a lot of objective exams and tests going on out there. So some of the common things you probably heard before in these conversations, but they're really worth repeating. If you're using test bank questions, alter them, make your stems clear and interrogative and brief. Avoid all or none of the above kinds of things. Don't announce your distractor items, and your distractors really should isolate student weaknesses to address errors in thinking, not trip them up or trick them. Make sure you've got parallel constructs. Avoid absolute statements or double negatives that will tend to make students think you're trying to trick them and then can freak them out, and they'll get bogged down on that particular item. Try to use 4 answers and not 3. Double-barreled questions, that is putting multiple different options in the same item. Avoid that because it's confusing to the reader and to the respondent. Calibrating exam times for the prepared student and activating your LMS security options. Some of this you've heard already from my colleagues in other settings, so I'm not going to belabor it too much if you've been part of those conversations. Assuming that tests are open node and open internet with clear guidelines for how you can acknowledge the sources that they're going to encounter, clarifying what openness means, and considering that giving them warm-ups for exams so they have time to practice the way that you're going to construct the summative exam. You can proctor exams via Zoom or other modes where practicable, but that is resource intensive and not always a reasonable way to go. You can activate your LMS security functions using similarity detection tools where you have them, conducting oral follow-ups, asking students to just talk through 1 or 2 questions with you face-to-face via Zoom or some other kind of interactive tool can really help you get another way to understand authenticity, and asking students to record short videos themselves and sending them to you if you can't talk to them one-on-one. We'll unpack all of these resources for you, I promise. There are a lot of good ones here. I'm not going to belabor them because I want to get to your questions, but there's a lot of rich stuff in these links that you'll be able to access. And finally, before we talk about your questions, I just want to remind you that we're going to get through this, and when we do, whatever the new normal looks like afterwards, the things that we're learning and discovering ourselves are modeling for ourselves and our peers and our students what it means to engage in innovative lifelong learning. That's been the story of online education over the past couple of decades. And what we do now is going to really set the bar for ourselves and our students and the profession and the world for the authenticity of what we do in remote and distant teaching environments. It's going to be a lot less scary when we get over to whatever the other side of this looks like. And we will get there most effectively if we start and end by trusting ourselves and our students. Most of our students are here to learn effectively, and we should focus on giving them the most authentic and the richest assessments and teaching and learning experiences that we can. So thank you very much. Make sure that you join our Google group. You can learn more about it there, where there are FAQs coming to academicintegrity.org. And then the third in our series of webinars is going to happen next week, this day at this time, 12:15 Eastern, led by Dr. James Orr from Virginia Commonwealth University, on what do you do to case manage academic misconduct issues in an online environment. So thank you a lot. I'm glad you had a chance to join us, and I'm eager to hear what you've been saying in the chat and what your questions are. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderators.
Thanks, Doug. This is Tricia, Bertram Gallant. I will be asking questions. There's been tons of good questions in the chat room and still more coming in. So we'll get through as many as we can. We have about 23 minutes, so we got some good time for some questions. So the first question I actually want to ask you is, how do you talked a lot about authentic assessments, and I'm on the same page with you that it's whether it's an in-person classroom or an online classroom, authentic assessments they're not cheat proof, right? But they reduce the motivations to cheat and the temptations and opportunities. So that's always a great thing. So a few people had questions about how do you verify still that the student is the person doing that assessment, whether it's an authentic assessment or maybe not an authentic assessment.
Yeah, it's a great question, and unfortunately, the answer is not a great one, which is unless your institution has invested probably more than most face-to-face institutions have been motivated to up till now in terms of online identity verification, because that's really what the question is getting at. There's going to be limited strategies for you. You can do some bootstrapped proctoring approaches. So there are ways to ask students to be on camera. You can ask them to, show their university ID on the camera with you, or otherwise try to find some way to authenticate that. But remember, there could be potential privacy issues that you want to be careful about navigating. I'm not going to speak a lot about that. First of all, it's a little bit beyond, well, it's the I'm not a lawyer disclaimer. But it's also the fact that this varies by institution, and then how the institution is applying the laws and the regulations that apply in these contexts can vary as well. So seek guidance from your teaching and learning center, from your supervision up the line at your organization about any guidance they have for doing things like asking students to authenticate via camera before an exam. But beyond that, we're left with really the same things that we're always using to authenticate or try to look for authenticity. And that is, if you're asking them to do an essay, then does the voice shift? If you're looking at a document, are there problems in the formatting that suggest a cut and paste? There aren't great answers here, and we're just going to have to do the best we can with the tools we have right now.
Great, thanks, Doug. So some other advice that people gave in the chat room, Mary Peterson said have them use their camera and take attendance through chats and throughout the session. That's a great idea. There were a couple other caveats to that though. I know that some universities are telling their faculty to not grade students on attendance and participation, because then you're going to be dealing with COVID-19, issues, and just to not do that. Plus time zones, some of your students may have to view your lecture asynchronously because they are, it's 2 a.m. where they are. And so that might not be possible in terms of giving students grades for it, but it might be possible to just connect with your students. So another great question is, there was a lot of buzz around your authentic assessment section of your presentation, and people loved it and had lots of good ideas for smaller classes, but the concerns were around classes of 200, 300, 400 students. How do you do that without, and to follow up with that, how do you do that without going crazy with, like, you only have 24 hours in the day to grade, right? And these things can take longer to grade. And if you don't have TAs, or you can't train them to grade that kind of higher level stuff, how do you do it?
Well, it's hard, and you're obviously not going to be able to do the richest authentic assessments in a class of, I'm thinking now of my own experience years ago when I taught a section of early American literature with 300 students. In that setting, though, I tried to introduce as much as it was humanly possible for me to respond to in terms of assessment. So it was a mix of objective and short answers, and short answers are a lower level, but still a very meaningful kind of construct assessment. If you think about that supply versus construct model that we talked about before, short answers are superior. I also had to really have a kind of stern talk with myself about what was the better part of the educational experience. And the learning science and literature really backs us up on this, that if you start with the learning outcomes that you're trying to assess, and think about what are the one or two richest ways to assess those in a more authentic and construct-oriented way as opposed to supply or traditional, and use those, it's probably going to give your students the opportunity to give you richer feedback. It's less, a lot of people are, I think, accustomed to wanting to have multiple items for each outcome, and that gets you to the 50 or the 60 item question or exam. But if you can recalibrate and think about fewer items that are richer in their construction, then you can have richer options. And the same thing with case studies or the nutrition example. One or two of those types of things are going to be richer ways for students to demonstrate their knowledge. And I would argue, especially in this environment, would be a better way to engage students in a moment of great stress than trying to give them a high stakes exam, primarily because it's easier to grade.
Great, thanks, Doug. Some other suggestions that were in the chat room in case people haven't seen them. There's some idea of training the trainers, right? Training the TAs and peer tutors, but there was some concern around that. Using grade scope rubrics, they can be really helpful. Then your TAs just have to click on them. So it makes it a little bit easier to grade higher order things. Another suggestion was prioritizing content. Cut down on the breadth. You kind of hinted at this earlier. Cut down on the breadth and focus on depth. So you have less, you might get more grading, but you might have less teaching, much less things that you have to try and cover. So those were all great ideas. There was also some conversation around authentic assessments, not so much to do with the large classroom, but something that I mentioned when I did the March 20th webinar was having students reflect that metacognition stuff of reflecting on their own process. They can be, they can take some time to grade, but having computer science students or engineers or chemists or biologists who are learning a particular, very particular set of skills and having them reflect on their process will help them in their lives, because you need to be able to communicate, how do you do this? You can't just do it, right? And so that can help as well. And I think there's some confusion in the chat room about what's this got to do with integrity. And again, it's about engaging students so they'll be less tempted to cheat. It doesn't mean they can't. We can't stop people from cheating. They're human beings, and human beings will make bad decisions under stress and pressure. But we can create learning environments in which integrity is the norm and cheating is the exception, because our students are engaged and connected with us.
And if I could just jump in and reinforce exactly that point, Tricia, you know, modality is not deterministically, is not ethically deterministic. And, you know, there might be an assumption that students cheat more online, but the research doesn't bear that out. And
Right.
my colleagues and I just published an article about this from a large data set.
Which I cited in my presentation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm going to put that on my win list. But the pressurized situations, including the one we're in, could drive students to cheat. So, but the important thing is not to obsess about the cheatability factor, because when we do, that shifts our own perspective as teachers about our students, and it will, even if we don't intend to, it will take us down a path of seeing them in an adversarial relationship to ourselves and the learning environment, and that itself will actually inadvertently and unintentionally, but very really, increase the likelihood of the very thing we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, and I was just trying to find it back in the chat. Someone said in the chat, trust is an underutilized technique. So I think that picks up on what you were saying. So there was a lot of questions around, you know, if you can't do authentic assessments because you don't have time, and you've got to try and put the, you know, the regular kind of tests on, you know, online or remote. What are some of the alternatives to proctoring? There's some people who are saying, you know, there's a lot of concerns right now about the privacy of using these proctoring companies. And so a lot of universities have actually said you're not allowed to use them. So how can we ensure, you know, better protect integrity in those types of situations?
So again, it's very situational, and there aren't any foolproof answers, but one approach that you can work if you're thinking about objective assessments that for whatever reason is the reality for you. One way is to have the students do the objective assessment and ask them to, within a certain amount of time, after a limited amount of time after the exam is over, to record, just do a voice recording or a video if that's capable, a 2 to 3 minute answer of 2 or 3 questions. And then they just send that to you. Now, that's gonna load up your inbox, yes, but what it does is it gives you a backup way if you have a question about the authenticity of the assessment when you're grading it, the exam, and you're unsure, then go to that student's submission. All students will have done it, and you'll have that as a backup set of information, but you don't have to immediately grade that. It's essentially a kind of authenticator after the fact that gives you a resource to help if you have a question, but you don't have a way to, you have a question about the integrity of the contribution, but you don't have a way to really verify it, then you can go to that and see, is the student convincingly talking about these items? And if you've got a couple of really, you know, items that are really critical to what you're trying to teach, you'll be able to discern pretty quickly in listening to or watching a student talk, can this student really be talking about this in a genuine way? And so that can be one way to try to introduce a kind of a proctoring by proxy.
Yeah, it's a great idea. Kind of switching a little bit. I wasn't gonna do an abrupt shift like this, but I just saw an interesting question in the chat,
Okay.
in the chat window. So Melinda's talking about how you know, she's seen a lot of advice, you know, not to use test bank questions necessarily. So she creates her own questions. It's short answers, but it takes her 45 minutes to an hour to write each question for 3 to 8 hours. So she's spending 3 to 8 hours per exam writing these questions, and she can't imagine having to do more exams like that. Is she spending too much time on these things in general, or what should she do?
Well, so, you know, these are the kinds of trade-offs that we have to make some kind of pretty mercenary calculations about in these kind of situations. So I'm not going to recommend one or the other. I'm going to talk just for a second about those two options. If you're thinking about a test bank, and what you have to really prioritize is the scale of the workload in terms of producing assessments. So if you've got a high teaching load, let's say you're in a 4-course environment or a 3-course environment, and there, you know, there's a lot of assessments to write, and you've elected to use assignment banks, then, as we talked about in the tactical part of the conversation, it's worth spending some time varying those question stems. It won't take you as long, and varying some of the items from what the test bank provided. It won't take quite as long as writing the exam, and it will reduce the cheatability of the student just going and copying and pasting into a search engine and seeing those answers returned. So that's the test bank side. If, however, you've got the time or you've elected to do the exam writing yourself, then, again, I would encourage, in that case, to think about introducing construct items rather than purely supply items, so that just from the mercenary perspective, you have to write fewer of them. So if you're using short answer questions, you're writing fewer of them than if you're writing true, false, or multiple choice questions. And it also gives you a chance to write more authentic prompts for your students to respond to.
Yeah. Thanks, Doug. Here's another good one is, do you have good examples or samples of how to guide students in and out through group projects? And before you answer, I'll just mention something that I mentioned in my webinar was with group projects, it's very, very important that you have students establish a team code of ethics up front. They can share that with you. I actually graded it in my class because I was teaching ethics, so it made sense to grade it. That's not necessarily something you have to do, but getting students to talk up front about how they're going to engage in their team honestly, with honesty, integrity, responsibility, respect, fairness, can really set the stage for good group work going forward in terms of integrity and just having the group function properly. Doug, do you have any other suggestions?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And when you do that, when you ask them to start their work in that way, start with the definition, the ICAI definition of the integrity that Tricia was alluding to. When they do that up front, then you can build that in to whatever deliverable it is that you're asking them to do. And so there could be some self-reflection from each group member on how the learning deliverable that came out of the group work lived up to the ethical commitments that they made to themselves and each other when they started. Similarly, having good guidance to students. First of all, just how to use the tools online to collaborate in ways that they might not be familiar with, but also what are kind of the rules of the road. They can co-construct some of that themselves in the ways that we're just talking about, and that's important. But you are the agent and the model for integrity and ethicality and authenticity that your students look for and see the most. And so they need to hear from you both about what appropriate conduct is and experience is in group work, and also what you expect of them. So it's not that you stop and do the ethical integrity part and you go back to teaching and learning. It's that they're all inextricably infused and connected to each other, and articulating that's important.
I agree. I always say to faculty when I'm doing presentations or workshops that we tell universities tell employers that that students learn how to do group work in our universities, but we don't actually teach them. We just throw them into groups and then say, hey, they've learned how to do group work, which is so not true. So we need to. You're going to have students work in teams and groups. You have to teach them how to do that. They don't know.
And be prepared for how you're going to handle dispute resolution. When one or two or more students are not pulling their weight or they're perceived not to be.
Well, and that's what I found the code of ethics really cut down, Doug. I had in my 5 years of teaching with team-based learning, I had one complaint of students. They worked it out themselves because they had their account. And key in that code of ethics is accountability. How are we going to hold each other accountable to this code of ethics? Yep. So that's a really important piece.
That's great.
There's a lot of individuals, Doug, we just have 6 more minutes. There's a lot of individuals who are asking about the technology piece. What if students don't have it? In fact, we just had a student email us saying they don't have a camera on their computer. So we said, well, use your phone. They said, I don't have a camera on my phone. So how do we help, or maybe they don't have good internet at home. What do we do with those students in a remote instruction environment? How do we work with them?
Well, I think this is a good moment to remember that, the difference between, absolute equal experiences versus equitable experiences. Mm-hmm. really striving for equitable experiences in these moments. Now, your offices of accessibility are going to be useful resources for you here, because beyond just the strict ADA compliance that we often think about in those offices, there's a lot of expertise in those offices about how to be creative and equitable. And so leverage the resources that your institution provides. But again, I know some people might think that we're off the path here when we're talking about assignment design and assessment and backwards design. But here's why the link between integrity and authenticity and those things about good teaching and learning are so infused. Here's where you go back to, okay, the student can't engage in the way or demonstrate the learning in the way that I had hoped because of a technology limitation. What am I trying to achieve? What's the outcome I'm asking students to demonstrate their mastery of? And then work backwards to think about the alternative way, given the situational factors and the available technology and access the student has. How could a student in that situation reasonably demonstrate equivalent knowledge that you are trying to accomplish in the other way? And there's simply no way to tell you what that would be, because it's going to be driven by the factors that your students have. But there are ways to work around, and there are ways to work with your institution. But it's also going to depend a lot on your institution as well, and how much support you do or don't have. Though we're all online at UMGC, we did have a student who used the library for internet access and didn't have a computer. So we shipped the student a computer with Wi-Fi capability. But again, that reflects a capacity within our institution. And so the problem solving is going to have to really be situational, both in terms of the student and your institution.
Yeah. Yeah, and check out, I know I have been immensely impressed at how the higher ed community has rallied in this time of need, and just the resources and the way we've gone virtual so fast has been really impressive. And I was just sharing with my staff this morning that our student affairs office has a webpage on this very topic, and where students can go for help, and a form to fill out if none of the things that they've got on their website work to solve their problem. They're doing loaner laptops. So definitely check with your student affairs departments on campus too, because they may be offering these kinds of services that you don't know about.
That's right.
So I think one last kind of a question, kind of a comment. So some of it is my commentary, not what people asked. But both of our first session and this session have focused on the educators. And so someone asked, is anybody going to be doing programming on integrity for students? And somebody else asked, what is the best practice regarding training in an online setting on avoiding plagiarism, making good choices, time management, etc. So I think that's a really good point. I know I can send to people, I'm going to put it in the chat box, the web link for the website that I put up for our students. We have been talking about doing something for students. I don't think we want to do an hour-long webinar. I don't think that's what students will tune into, but maybe 10, 12-minute kind of remote instruction, remote learning life hacks or something like that. Doug, does UMGC do anything?
Well, so because we're fully asynchronous, because of our worldwide population, we rely less on face-to-face live experiences than asynchronous tools. But we do have a tutorial on academic integrity that is open source, that we designed purposely to be open source, to be shared. And so that's the way we teach our students initially about integrity. There are baked into our processes about how to teach and learn in other orientation experiences is where we teach them about how they learn online. So those aren't modularized in that way. But I think there's certainly things we could put together pretty quickly if we're talking about how to learn online with integrity in terms of the use of technology tools online, separate and apart from things like citation management and attribution and the sort of bread and butter issues of integrity. I think we can certainly put something together along those lines.
Great. Thanks, Doug. Camilla, we have a minute left. Do you want to hop back on audio and let people know what's going to happen with the slides and the PowerPoint and the chat history?
Yes, thanks. We've been trying to keep up definitely with all of the chat rooms. And so just as a reminder, after we end this presentation, we will be able to now might give us a day or so, but be able to send out to the email that you registered with for this webinar. We will send you a link to the webinar. We will also send out a PDF of the slides that Doug shared. And then we have, throughout this time, the moderators have been working to compile a list of all the resources that have been shared in the chat room. So we will also be able to share a document with all of that information as well. So it won't be the full chat room, so you don't get all the little comments, but any resources and the information that has been shared by other participants will be able to be shared with you. So you will get that, and you are free to share that with your colleagues. So if colleagues were not able to join you today, you may feel free to share that. We will also have it on our Facebook page that you can share as well. You will be receiving, or information will be coming out either later today or tomorrow about the webinar that Doug mentioned at the tail end of his discussion. That will be held same time, same day, just next week for our third and kind of what we're seeing as final part of this series on looking at policy and how you might have to have changed your adjudication process. So with that, thank you very much for your attendance, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you next week as well. If you have additional questions or want more information about the International Center for Academic Integrity, feel free to email info@academicintegrity.org. So thank you very much.